All right, everybody, we got a guest here today. We got Dr. Allison Brager. Did I say your last name properly?
Yes, you did.
Okay, perfectly. Perfect. We're gonna chat about a whole bunch of topics. But yeah, thanks, Boz, for bringing her to the attention here. We're gonna have a great show.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super stoked. I've met Allison a few times over the years, and most recently we've had some time to hang out at Power Monkey Camp, which I
Yeah.
highly recommend. And Allison was there when I did the full Power Monkey and giving some discussions on the importance of sleep. And I thought, we've had some people on the show to talk about nutrition in depth, obviously training in depth, and all things affiliate related. But sleep is one of those items that, people have this kind of nebulous understanding of it. And you'll never hear somebody say, oh, you should sleep less. But when you
Mhm.
dig into like what does that actually mean to get good quality sleep? And like,
Hmm.
what is so important about that? People really don't, in my experience, have a lot of depth to that knowledge. So super curious to pick your brain there.
It
Yeah.
could be the sleep show. We've got some other topics as
Yeah.
well. But before we dive in there, just in case anybody didn't actually read the show notes, I'll give a bit of your background and resume here. Dr. Allison Brager, active duty neurobiologist and major in the U.S. Army, who is currently at West Point, but previously supporting Special Forces and NATO partners, done some deployments, currently reapplied as a NASA astronaut candidate. I'm not going to let you get away without chatting about that for a little bit. Uh, it's got some specific research in genetic and neurobiological factors of resiliency to extreme stress and extreme environments, everywhere from Antarctica to Central American rainforests, Olympic athletes, special forces, the whole 9 yards. And yeah, former D1 athlete. We're gonna have a blast today. And yeah, just thanks for being here.
Of course, absolutely. It's good to be back with you too. Thanks for the shout out for Power Monkey. It's the best week of most people's lives once they go and they genuinely believe that.
Before we chat sleep, what is a neurobiologist?
So it's essentially someone who studies the biology of the brain. So looking at molecular factors, neurochemical factors, and how those have downstream consequences on behavior. So sleep has always been my bread and butter, but it's not necessarily like the elements of sleep I study. It's more the factors behind those elements. So why does this particular gene lead to someone being a night owl, or this particular genetic factor lead to someone being a morning person? Or why does this genetic factor give some people the ability to quickly recover from sleep deprivation versus not recover very well? So that's, I guess, the best way to describe it.
Oh man, well, it's so funny that you mentioned some of those because I actually had some specific questions written down about those things. It's kind of interesting. I'm just looking down my list here. And so to dive right in, you're talking about genetic variants that can cause different preferences in people, or maybe not even preferences, or just behaviors. Um, I had just a basic question. I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words here, but you see such gradation in so many other things that people choose to do. But when it
Mhm.
comes to things like nutrition, sleep, sometimes even exercise recommendations, people get really rigid and they try to fit it
Yep.
into this one size fits all type of box. So, can we just park there for a second? What kind of variation do you see? I guess, like, do night owls really exist? Is that actually a thing? Or is that just me convincing myself that I like to stay up late?
Yeah, so they do exist. And funny enough, before you came to Power Monkey Camp, I used to give this questionnaire called the morning evening questionnaire. But it got to the point like where we couldn't even get through it because there's 19 questions and people would like raise their hands for clarification. So I just chose to get rid of it. Um, but 80% of the population are like generally what we call intermediates, which means they typically wake up between like 7 a.m., are tired, and go to sleep around 11 p.m. 10% of the population are true morning people, and 10% are true evening. I'm an evening person. I know I am one because my parents were, and just I look at my life and sports I pre-selected into, like gymnastics. Um, Practice would end around 9 p.m. I'd come home, I'd eat, I'd do homework, I'd go to bed. That was normal and natural for me. I maintained that lateness in college and beyond college. But there's this questionnaire. It's called the morning evening questionnaire. It's 19 questions. Some of them are a little repetitive. That's like the tried and true way to do it. And then if you want to take an extra step, so years ago I did 23andMe. And I had my whole DNA sequenced. I was able to pull up the raw data, and for those specific mutations on certain genes that are related to being a night person, I was able to find I had those mutations. But yes, night owls and larks do exist. And I think that's really where you start to see it, especially in the world of elite athletics, because you have people who more or less, right, rise to the top in their sport, because they have the talent, they put in the hard work, but then also too, like their sport caters to being a morning person or an evening person. So like gymnastics, basketball players, and hockey players, right? Those are sports that practice at night versus rowing or say long distance running. Those are sports that, they practice in the morning.
Hmm. Man, it's
Everyone
interesting.
else
So
is in between.
yeah, so as a follow-up, and maybe this is a bit of a, you know, unrefined question, but so if that is true that there's different, people that are able to manage these different schedules and be fine, can it be inferred from that that sleeping for an 8-hour window or however many hours is recommended, as long as that's being met and it's actually in line with that person's, I guess in this case, genetics, is it comparable? Because you hear that sometimes that it's like, well, it doesn't count if it's past midnight. Those hours are less quality than sleep that's happening earlier. Like, so what kind of truth is in a statement like that,
No, that's a
if it
great
is the
question.
case?
There is a lot of truth. And I think that's like one of the good things about certain wearables like Whoop. So like Whoop, for example, they factor in, it's called your chronotype. And if they find from like just gathering millions of data from Whoop users that if their chronotype is more aligned with their rise time and bedtime, then those individuals are more likely to have that restorative sleep. So to your point, it is like a myth, because I think most of society operates on the fact that like only successful people in society are morning people, right?
Right.
It's kind of
Yep.
like, in the CrossFit gym when the 6 a.m.ers poo poo on everyone else who doesn't work out at 6 a.m. and chooses to work out in the evening. And so, yeah, if you align your natural rhythm with your sleep schedule and you're getting 8 hours, you're going to maximize your recovery.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. That's
Out of
yeah.
out of oh, go ahead, Boz.
Well, I was just going to say, on a personal level, that's something I always had to kind of come to blows with. There were many, many years when I was still actively coaching a lot that, I was up, in my opinion, heinously early because I had to as a product of that job. I'd be
Yeah.
coaching a 5 a.m. class or a 6 a.m. class. And so you craft your schedule around that. And, not a big deal. People do that sort of thing all the time, but it never felt like it was good for me to be
Yeah.
doing it. I never really enjoyed that schedule. And there is always that kind of voice in the back of my head that's like, hey, you're kind of lazy if I wake up a little later, even though I'm staying up a little later. And I do think
Yeah.
that my level of productivity is comparable. So it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. No, definitely. There's a lot of ties between your chronotype and performance. Like we know, for example, like you have your peak athletic performance, especially if you're doing like highly metabolically demanding activity later in the day. So like power and stamina, there's this great study in Olympic weightlifters to show that Olympic weightlifters perform better in the evening because that's when like those energy systems are prioritized. So like epinephrine and norepinephrine and all those pathways that create power and stamina, the Olympic lifters will do better then than in the early morning. And the only way that the morning people can hit their evening numbers is with caffeine. Um, Whereas like very cognitively demanding hand-eye motor coordination sports, you're going to do better everyone's going to do better at those like late morning because it aligns with the rise in cortisol, um, which is catered towards attention, vigilance, focus. So there's a whole fascinating science in around like chronotype, the time of athletic activity and performance.
Interesting. I'm curious. I can see that being highly beneficial to somebody that has profound freedom over their daily schedule,
Yep.
which might be a very small uh, group of folks. But if
Yep.
that's your life and you're a professional athlete and you can tailor your training day, I can see how that's a great thing. Now, if we shift to like most people, most circumstances, most of the time, where we're like, um, I might be a night owl or a morning person, but regardless, I have to get up at this hour because the school starts at this time. I
Yeah.
gotta get my daughter there, and that's just it don't matter. And I gotta go to bed at
Yep.
this hour because if I don't, I'm screwed. And ideally, I do my hand-eye coordination here, but I can't do that then because I got a Zoom call for work, and I got a Olympic lift here, and I got a 30-minute window, and like nobody cares about my chronotype. Nobody
Yeah.
cares about any of that stuff. And so in an ideal world, you'd cater it beautifully and you'd optimize your astonishing performance as a human being in all facets.
Yeah.
And then enter everything else that we've got to juggle, not to reduce it, but in that situation for the average Joe overworked with, multiple kids and responsibilities, does it just become get this as much sleep as you can when you can and fit it in? Or
Mhm.
like what's that real life kind of happy medium?
Yeah, so that's exactly what it is. I'm so happy you brought that up because like that's the constant struggle we even have within military populations, right? Is like, yes, even then we would love to plan training and operations around our peaks, right? But the reality is right, we win our nation's wars at night. We fight at night. And so, yes, it would help if we could pre-select all the night owls and cater them to night operations. That's not going to happen. Um, but that's where like things like sleep banking actually do work. So people, it's not a myth. Sleep banking is a thing. That's actually a concept we came up with at Walter Reed when I was there overseeing their sleep research center. So we found that if you let people sleep in about 30 to 45 minutes more than usual over, say, a week or two, when they're then exposed to this chronic sleep deprivation or even acute sleep deprivation, they have reduced declines in performance. And then
Interesting.
for day-to-day life, right, there really is a huge benefit to a 20 or 30-minute nap. Like just lying down on the ground and closing your eyes, it will force your brain into this state called alpha state, like is enough to help quickly reset neuronal pathways so that you can then, carry on with the rest of your day more normally.
So
I've
the
got,
the the power of a cat nap is a beautiful thing.
Mhm.
yeah, I've got two questions that jump to mind immediately based on that. So this concept of sleep banking, to extend the analogy, does it make sense that I can pay off my sleep debt then, or is it better to not go into debt in the first place? I mean, obviously that's probably the case, but if I
Yeah.
can bank it, can I pay off the debt?
Yeah, so actually that's one of the things and that's what we found, at least when we did these sleep banking studies and like the normal controlled healthy population. So we did them like in the lab and then we took them out to the field. We were working a lot with the Ranger Regiment. And we found that like in normal healthy, let's say 23-year-old men who get 8 or 9 hours of sleep and somehow have the time to do one of these like 2-week long in-lab sleep studies, like their rate of decline in a non-sleep debt state was still less. But this phenomenon still worked in an already chronically sleep deprived population like the Army Rangers.
Hmm, interesting. Yeah.
This might be obvious, but can you speak to, for lack of a better way to say it, the benefits of adequate sleep? And then there's far too many people that are just not getting enough and they're just sucking it up and they're dealing with it. And they probably have a whole lot of things going slightly sideways or wrong in their life that maybe is related to that lack of sleep, but they're not attributing it to that. Like, so what could we expect from good healthy sleep, and then when that starts to get into a deficit, what have you seen be the negative consequences of that?
So I'll start with the bad news before the good news.
Okay, here we go.
As like one of the godfather of sleep medicine used to say, he was at Stanford. Dr. Dement, is that sleepiness makes you stupid. Like sleepiness creates a level of cognitive dissonance. That's like what we would say, where you think you're okay and you're really not. And
Mm,
unfortunately, that like compounding sleep that comes out during times you don't want it to, right? Like when you're driving a car and you feel like you're going to fall asleep at the wheel, or like, something, a lot of fatigue related accidents in the military or the aviation community are due to this compounding chronic sleep debt. Someone who is a normal, healthy sleeper will not have this urge, right? When you're doing like seamlessly boring, mundane tasks, they can still focus and pay attention. They're not going to have like slow rolling eye movements where their eyes are like rolling in the back of their head and they're nodding forward because they're trying to like maintain wakefulness. And there are ways to test for that. We have questionnaires. There's this thing called an Epworth sleepiness scale. Like we give it to people. Of course, like there's a lot of underreporting of certain behavior on it. But I think that's one really cool thing about the wearable space too, is like it picks up on these like nuanced physiological differences associated with, sufficient sleep versus insufficient sleep, and can alert people to, the fact they're fatigued before the person even realizes they're fatigued.
Hmm.
interesting. And then with, that's obviously cognitive ability, what, but then with regards to like physical performance, we would assume just lower levels of muscle contraction. You're not going to be as powerful. You're not going to be as explosive. You're going to not feel recovered. Maybe your central nervous system isn't firing as sharp as it should. And all of those, we're going to expect you to perform physical tasks weaker, slower, worse, et cetera, et cetera. Fair to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where, to use CrossFit, for example, like if you're doing certain benchmarks or like say certain tests, like anaerobic metabolic tests, that's where I feel like sleep deprivation would most come out. The perfect example would be like, I feel like airdyne workouts are a big key indicator of like, did you have a good night of sleep or not? Because someone who has had insufficient sleep, they're going to have like a reduced lactic acid tolerance. We know sleep deprivation is associated with reduced pain tolerance. And so they're not going to be clearing their lactic acid as quickly.
Mm.
They're going to feel, that 30, 45-second airdyne sprint much more than somebody who has gotten sufficient sleep.
That's the good and bad thing too about repeat workouts or benchmarks and metrics, right? Like
Mhm.
obviously the data is critical, like obviously. And when given enough, you get a general idea as to which way something's trending. But like if you just look at one of those specs, right? Like I did fill in the blank workout and I did this workout 8 months ago and my time today was 12 seconds slower and therefore my whole life is a failure because I was 12 seconds slower in this workout. It's like, okay, the workout and the reps were the same as 8 months ago, but you probably don't remember how you slept for the 3 to 5 days
Yeah.
prior to the last time you did this workout, how your nutrition was for the 3 to 5 days, your life stressors, all of that stuff. So, yes, the workout was the same, but you could be, even in a 72-hour window, a fairly different human being
Yeah.
performing the same tests. And then all you do is you look at the time and you go, damn it, 12 seconds slower. It's like, I think there's a whole lot of other factors that people don't take into account because they're not easily measurable. It's my 2 cents
Yep.
on
It's
that.
funny you say that, Pat, because I had that realization on the opposite lens the other day. 2 days ago, my hamstrings are still screaming. We did Diane and I did it in
Sure.
3:39. And
Oh, wow.
well, I mean, when I was competing in the games, I
Well
could knock
done.
it down to like 3 minutes. So like 3:39 is pretty good at like 40, almost 41.
I would say so.
Yeah, I'd
Um,
take it.
but the last time I did it, I think I got 3:55, but it was like literally after I flew from the West Coast back to Fort Bragg and like I got off the plane, had some water and yeah, like so much can change and in that 20 to create that 20-second gap. Or it could simply be that like I had easier access to the mat and the barbell. I wasn't walking
Yeah,
as far
sure.
the other day. So
And I know it's anecdotal, so it's not worth much, but I mean, I've been working out long enough to know myself relatively well, and A lot of the factors in my life are generally the same. I'm a boring eater. It's like my schedule's kind of the same. But I'm traditionally a horrific sleeper. Just a terrible, terrible, terrible sleeper. And every now and then I'll get like a good night's sleep, and I walk into the gym feeling like this is amazing. I can tell immediately what it was. It was the night's sleep. So I've experienced it personally as to how powerful
Yeah.
it is. And yeah, it's something I wish I could replicate on a. I guess are there tips or tricks for bad sleepers to become better sleepers, or you're like, much like if you're a night owl or a morning person, you're like, sorry, you were just dealt that card of you got a busy head, you can't shut it off, and too bad, my friend.
No, there is. So funny, like people think that drugs are the solution for better sleep. Actually, the most effective form of treatment for sleep disturbances and insomnia in particular is cognitive behavioral therapy. So, like for people who have a very active, busy mind, there are trained clinical psychologists who teach this methodology to like how to like turn your brain off. And a lot of it comes like it sounds silly, but it's true, like counting sheep or
Mm-hmm.
like progressive muscle relaxation where you focus on like slowly relaxing different body parts. Even things like practicing yoga nidra. So, listening to this 10-minute like breath work exercise with meditation music in the background. And then the other thing too, really what controls sleep quality is temperature. So like getting a cooling pad to put over top of your mattress can go a long way to help drive your body down into the right core body temperature to get a good night of sleep.
I'm all for. I'll make my wife wear a sweatsuit at night. I'll crank that thermostat down. You know what I mean?
Yep.
I'm all for that. That works great for me. But yeah, I had this buddy who I was so jealous of. We did a motorcycle trip together, and like I'll typically, doesn't matter if I'm in my home bed or somewhere else. I can't blame the bed. I'll wake up 5 to 6 times a night, in an 8 hour period. It could be for a minute or it could be for 15 minutes. And
Mhm.
he will lay down, be asleep within 11 seconds, and wake up 9 hours later with a muscle hasn't moved, is in the exact same position. He's like, oh, I'm like, if I had 3 wishes, that would be one of that's that
That'd
every
be one
morning
of
he's
your
just
three
like, I
wishes.
feel great. I was like, that's just God bless. Doesn't matter what the bed's like, doesn't matter what the temperature's like. I'm like, that is a superpower right there to be able to sleep like that. And so yeah, sleep has always been kind of on the forefront of my mind.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I have so many questions that like every time you guys are exchanging, I just have like two or three more that pop in. So if we go back a little bit, Allison, you were talking about how it's not normal to lose focus on a mundane task or start nodding off when you're, driving down the road or whatever, assuming it's not 2 a.m. and you're not on this like crazy road trip.
Yeah.
But it's a normal time of day that should not be happening. So is it too much of a leap to take that if somebody is experiencing that, like maybe they have an undiagnosed sleep problem that they should probably get checked out? Like, is that a
Yep.
thing?
Yeah, so that is like any sort of daytime sleepiness outside of like the normal window of the fact that most of us get sleepy. Well, it's almost 4 o'clock now. So this is like you caught me in like, my circadian low point, like most humans in society, right? But I'm a night owl, so mine is actually gonna be an hour from now.
Yeah.
But outside of like that time window, if you cannot maintain wakefulness throughout the day, and say you've been in bed, like your time in bed is 8 to 9 hours, and the only thing keeping you awake is a stimulant, then yes, you should probably get checked out for a sleep disorder because you either, have some minor to major form of narcolepsy and or sleep apnea. Because that's the thing about sleep apnea is like you don't recognize that you're suffocating in your sleep, and your brain is so quick to go back into sleep before it wakes up again. But that does have lingering and chronic effects during the waking day that you can't maintain wakefulness doing normal mundane stuff.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so then kind of as an extension, I'm always curious because, the human animal is so adaptable. And part of that adaptation is like, hey, even when things are bad and have been bad for a long time, you can reverse course in a lot of cases. However,
Yeah.
there's limits, right? So obesity is a great example. Like somebody can let that train go down the tracks for a long time, reverse it and see many of the problems associated with that also fall away. But there is a limit where at a certain point you've done some damage to the organism and like you just can't turn that around completely.
Yeah.
What does that look like with sleep? And is that the case? Can you put yourself in a state where you've damaged the engine to the point that no amount of sleep banking is going to bring you back from that brink? And like, what is that limit if it does exist?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we see that a lot in, like, we'll say, like, career long military and or shift workers, because in general, for every day of sleep loss, of poor sleep, it takes 2 days of good sleep. So if you're talking in someone who
Hmm.
has like a career long military and or has been a shift worker for 30 years, you're talking about an extra 40 or 50 years of their life, which they probably don't even have to make up that lost sleep. But in that meantime, like, we know reduced insulin sensitivity, right? So pre-diabetic, increased risk for cancer. And in fact, shift work has been deemed a level 2 carcinogen by the World Health Organization, because there's
Hmm.
such a strong link now between night shift workers and rotating shift workers, and the link for pretty much every single type of cancer. And yeah, it is, and same with neuronal health, right? It like pre early onset neuronal degeneration, like, you're going to see that more commonly with chronic sleep deprivation. And there have been studies done now, actually, in humans, with just like 2 weeks of chronic sleep deprivation, where instead of getting 8 hours of sleep in a 2 week bout, you're getting 5 hours of sleep. That may have like permanent impact on the neuronal health and like the
Hmm.
sort of like the foundation of the nerve cells in your brain.
Wow. It's scary.
Yep, I know. Sometimes the more you learn, you're like, ignorance is bliss
Well,
sometimes.
but on the other hand, it's a good catalyst to, build up some healthy hygiene around these types of things too, you know?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's where it is. It's like the best practices, I think everyone knows now, right? Keep your cell phone out of the room. Try to minimize blue light exposure. Like, don't do anything exciting or entertaining leading up to bed. Like, have a wind down routine, take a hot shower. But other things people don't think about, like, we've been doing a lot of work within the military for, or like even supplements. Like, there's certain supplements you can take that can help augment sleep or help preserve, protect brain health, especially in like high stress situations. So creatine is one of them. Like, there has been a huge push now. Like, people always think of creatine for like muscle building and preserving lean muscle mass, but really one of creatine's major roles is it's one of the major fuel sources of the brain. And
Hmm.
so if you can preload the brain with creatine, then the brain is more apt to perform under high stress or sleep deprivation, particularly in people who've had, a concussion or several concussions in the past.
Hmm.
Interesting. I've got a question for you. So, make sure I formulate this properly. Obviously, in an ideal world, you'd get wonderful sleep if you had to do something complex, something technically challenging, something risky, or whatever it happens to be.
Mhm.
I'm going to go ahead and assume that, having worked for years with the Special Operations Forces, they don't always have that luxury. So sometimes they're going to have to do very risky, very complicated, very fill in the blank things
Mhm.
while relatively exhausted.
Yep.
And the stakes are high. And in part of your bio there, it said you've done research with like also factors of resiliency to extreme stress. So do you
Yep.
have some tips, tricks, hacks, whatever the proper word is, for setting yourself up for success if you have to be in such a situation?
So I think I have a very different theory on this, and it is based on the research we've done. A lot of that comes down to a lot of things in terms of why people become the tip of the spear, right? Because if you think about special forces, right, they are the tip of the spear in what they do. It comes down to their genetic blueprint. They essentially have the genetic blueprint of someone who has resiliency to sleep deprivation. So I'll backtrack some. When I was working at Walter Reed, we did this study where we basically we basically kept people awake for 80% of a 3 week period. So they went through like 3 different cycles of 48 hours of full on sleep deprivation. And
That
we were
sounds
doing
like a
that.
bummer.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
They got paid thousands of dollars to be in our study,
Okay.
but thousands of dollars. I would still not do it
No.
because you don't see sunlight for like 3 weeks either. You're just eating like you're on an isocaloric diet and you're like,
Jeez.
living in a college dorm room for 3 weeks with three
Oh.
random strangers. And, you can't know what time of day it is because that will influence your sleep. But,
Okay.
but that
Yeah, sounds
aside,
like a blast.
yeah, no, I'd rather chew on a light bulb. Um, but we found like in this like extreme sleep deprivation, which again does mimic sometimes what happens in the operational environment. When I was deployed during the war, there was like a 70-hour period where we genuinely could not sleep outside the wire. And we found this genetic mutation in the adenosine receptor. So the adenosine receptor, right, is what caffeine binds to mask sleepiness and promote wakefulness. Fast forward a few years, we were doing like a whole, and this is all published data, we were doing a whole genetic screen and study with the Ranger Regiment. And we found that this gene that was only present in like 5 to 10% of the normal population in our in-lab study was present in like 80% of the Ranger Regiment. So I tell people like selection, whether it's bud selection, Green Beret selection, which I help with, or even Ranger School, like you're selecting for people who have good genetics, because there is a huge tie-in to genetics and even injury risk and genetics and like how you endure stress and sleep deprivation. And
Do
I know
you?
that seems like a not positive answer.
No. Do you think? And I'm gonna now flex the fact that I have no smarts in this area whatsoever, and I barely graduated college as a sociologist. That word that you use, whatever it was there, like, is that you're born with it and you've got what you've got, or can it be uh, built up and adapted? Because is there the possibility that 80% in the Ranger Regiment sounds like such an astonishingly high percentage if only 5 to 10% of the population has it? Do you think that's just it is what it is, or do people go through selection, go through these things, and actually adapt to it and become better in that area? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So from the research we've done over the years, and this is even before my time in the military, because a lot of our research in the military is focused on this resiliency to sleep deprivation, resiliency to stress. So resiliency to say like emotional stress or like higher order cognitive stress, um, decision making can be taught, right? You can learn to be self-aware of if you're, in a downward spiral emotionally while you're sleep deprived or stressed. But with sleep deprivation, it's not that fancy. Like it's literally you can't train sleep deprivation. I know people
Interesting.
think
Okay.
they can, but they can't. And we show that time and time and again in the
You got
lab.
it or you don't.
You got it or you don't. Like to go back to Dr. Dement, we time to time show again that like sleepiness makes you stupid.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm as curious because a lot of those programs, those special operations selection programs, they don't want to waste money on candidates that are going to wash out, and so they're always looking for ways to screen for better candidates to show up that will have a higher selection rate. And
Yep.
usually, whatever they try to figure out doesn't yield results. This sport versus that sport versus whatever, that I wonder if that's actually one of the things that's quite meaningful.
Yeah, so we've made some progress, and it seems to like change over time because we were allowed to do like those types of studies. But then we were told now, like if we do, it requires Secretary of the Defense approval, which is ridiculous, but it
It
is what it
yeah,
is.
sounds like a
And
lot. Yeah.
but at the end of the day, like some people will argue, well, that's not ethically fair or morally fair, but I'm sorry, war is not morally or ethically fair sometimes
Sure.
either. So,
Well, I mean, it's weird what factors people choose to, I guess, levy that fairness argument against. You know what I mean? Like height is always the classic example. That's a huge advantage for many
yep,
sports. And like that's kind of the card I'm dealt. And sorry, there's not much I can do with it. We all seem to
yeah,
accept that, but we can't seem to accept it in other areas.
yeah,
Anyway, but
agreed.
um, I want to just shift gears just a little bit and talk about, oh, sorry. This idea of stimulating the brain. And this is
Mhm.
something that I think one of the more recent times that I hung out with you a little bit, I heard you talking about just how disastrous certain energy drinks are on the market these
Yep.
days. And I've taken that information and I've thrown that in the faces of a couple of my friends now that really needed to hear it. So thank you for
Hell
that.
yeah.
And they're probably listening, so you know who you are. But can you talk about the differences in, some reasonable ways to kind of stimulate the brain when you need to, and some ways that are maybe way overboard and why?
Yeah, so energy drinks are never a good solution. And we have evidence from this. So during the war, we were part of, they're called mental health advisory teams, or MHATs for shorts. And we would go out, embed ourselves within a unit, pre-deployment, deploy with that unit, and then capture like certain lifestyle factors or like operational stresses, like where they were sleeping, how they were sleeping, what was like the overall psychological demands of the operation, and bring that information back to the Pentagon to help inform decisions, right, during this long enduring 22-year war. So one of these mental health advisory teams, I wasn't on this one, but this is another one that embedded themselves within the 3rd Infantry Division. And what they found was those soldiers during that deployment, so same mission, 600 and some soldiers, those who consumed or self-reported that they had 2 or more energy drinks in a day during that deployment, when they came back and they looked at rates of, clinical inventories of PTSD, anxiety, depression, fatigue, aggression, and burnout, they had increased risk in all those domains because of, like there's a correlative risk with energy drinks. And this is twofold, right? Right, why do you need more than 2 energy drinks in a day, right, to maintain wakefulness? That is a lot. I have one, and I feel like I have to work out for 5 hours after. And I am a habitual coffee drinker, right? I love
Right.
my like high octane coffee in the morning. The other thing is too, is like there is preclinical animal models to support that, right? If you look at the ingredient list on energy drinks, you can't even pronounce, let
Hmm.
alone understand like what half the things are in there. Like, and so there are preclinical animal studies to show that it causes neurodegeneration of certain brain areas, and can cause premature neuronal cell death, again, in these preclinical animal models. But there are a lot of parallels between work we do, right, in animal studies and then like corroborative evidence in humans. So yeah, they're just terrible for your brain.
Yeah, anytime you're talking about
Man.
neuronal cell death, I think that's something I'd like to avoid when possible.
Yeah, the
You
Sounds
technical
reasonable.
term is neurotoxicity.
Yeah, yeah. And why? Why? Just to really break it down and like hit people over the head with it. Like, why? What's the difference between a high octane cup of coffee, like you said, and something like an energy drink that
Mm.
may seem like, oh, this is just relatively benign because it's quote the same thing,
Just
just
caffeine,
maybe. Yeah,
man. What's your
exactly. It's a little
problem?
Yeah.
stronger. Or like, what's the difference there?
So it's not just caffeine. So the caffeine that's sourced from coffee, that is targeting essentially one system of the brain. That's targeting the adenosine receptor. So it targets its adenosine 2A receptor. And what it does is it reduces adenosine, which helps promote wakefulness. Energy drinks, like sure, they have caffeine, so it's going to act on adenosine. But then with all the other chemical additives, it also causes increased release of dopamine and glutamate. And glutamate is an excitatory chemical. We all know dopamine is an excitatory chemical. Um, but in the brain, when there's too much glutamate that is released from one neuron that then binds to a secondary neuron, if that chemical electrical signal is so strong, it will actually cause this secondary neuron to die off. Like, I don't want to say it's like the equivalent of the neuron being electrocuted, but essentially that is what happens.
Hmm.
And it's actually part of the reason why, if you remember in Chinese food back in the day, there used to be MSG, right, to create that like really savory taste. That's part of the reason why the FDA got rid of MSG and a lot of Chinese food here in the United States is because it was leading to neurotoxicity in a very similar manner that you would see with glutamate from energy drinks.
Well, there you have it. And sadly, often in the military, those two energy drinks will be pounded down. And then if you need extra help staying awake, they'll just be a big old lip full of Skull or Copenhagen to help kind of
Yep.
keep
Or now
you
it's
going for a
Zen. That's
while.
what they use. That's
Oh,
what the
that's
kids
okay.
use
Gotcha.
now, Zen.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, this is all like preclinical animal studies, but again, I'm sure if we did do those types of studies in humans, we'd find similar findings. But the behavioral health studies, I think, are foretelling.
Is
You heard it here first. Melt your brain. It's no
is
good.
the 8 hours that's always thrown around, is there anything to that? And as a rough metrics, like eight's generally enough for most people. And are there numbers that you hear as a specialist that I can tell you, on average, I sleep this much per night? You're like, yeah, okay, you're probably okay. And I give you a different number. You're like, ooh, you're heading off a cliff if you haven't fallen off it already. What are those numbers?
So for most people, that's around 6. And that's what I would
6 is
say.
the off a cliff, or the 6 is
6 is off the cliff.
okay.
Yeah. So that's like one of the things we find is like the point of no return. So time and time again, when we do these like studies of chronic sleep deprivation in like very controlled settings, whether we're looking at cognitive performance, physical performance, testosterone levels, after about 3 days of 5 to 6 hours of sleep, like the system, it doesn't recover and it continues to have a downward trend and decline. Versus someone who's getting 7 hours or more, like they're pretty stable for the most part, because right, like 98% of the population does need about 8 hours of sleep. About 2% of the population are genetically lucky. And again, you find this, and I'm sure special operators too, if we look for it, there is like such thing as the short sleep gene. It's called DEC2, DEC2. That's linked to, you only need 3 or 4 hours of sleep and you wake up feeling great and well rested and you go about your day. And, as long as you get your 3 to 4 hours, you're good.
Boz, you're
but-
not going to war every year, but when you go to games week, what are you getting each night at the games?
Oh man. Well, I'll tell you, in the last couple of years, it's actually been a lot better than it was in the earlier days when we had a smaller
What was a
team
bad one? What's a bad year?
Oh boy. I mean, if we got 2 or 3 hours for that,
Yeah.
7 or 8 day stretch, we were living pretty good.
2 to 3 hours a night for 7
Oh my
days.
gosh.
That's why you're missing a
Yeah.
rep every now and then, man. You're cognitively not there.
I will say again, in fairness, it's been a lot of years since we've had to run that kind of extremity, but yeah.
Was that
Yeah.
back when we were like out in like Manhattan Beach or Redondo
Yeah,
Beach?
the Carson days
Yeah.
were rough. We were
Yeah.
we were punching above our weight class a little bit at that
Well,
time, So
Yeah. It was rough for you and it was rough for us too. I mean,
yeah. I'm kind of curious, you mentioned that about, hey, there are a certain subset of people that can manage on like this really radically reduced amount of sleep. Kind of along those same lines, like every couple of years, you see different trends come up in kind of the health and fitness world. One that I haven't seen come up in a little bit, but I expect it's going to rear its ugly head anytime now, because that's just the way things go, is this idea of like phasic sleep.
oh
it's like-
yeah, the Tim Ferriss method.
Yeah. Well, if I just do 2 hours,
What in the world is that? I've
No,
never
dude,
even
it
heard of
comes
that.
up every couple of years. Well, you're gonna live your life, Pat.
Okay.
And every 2 to 3 hours, you're gonna take like a 15-minute cat nap, and you're just gonna do that on repeat on a 24-hour cycle. I don't have the exact protocol because people will
Okay.
have their own kind of secret cocktail around that. But the idea is that you will be a hyper-productive god because you just have so much more alert time and you just get the bare minimum of sleep that you need periodically throughout that 24-hour cycle. And inevitably, this will come up. I'll see some people get on this trend, and about 2 weeks later, they are hating their life.
Just crash and burn.
Yes,
Yep.
but it never goes away. So I guess I don't know if I have a good question in that, but like that is supported always by such and such famous super genius did this
Yeah.
schedule 300 years ago, and look at the marvels that they created. Can you
Yeah,
speak to
because
the
they're
validity
genetically
to any of
gifted.
that? Okay.
That's why. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, that was in the Tim Ferriss 40-hour body book. And it's one of those things like good initiative, bad judgment, because it's timed around like dips in core body temperature. So this idea if you took 6 20-minute naps throughout the day, you were good because you were hitting your REM sleep. Well, you need non-REM sleep for like your testosterone release and stuff. But also too, like, yeah, they have done clinical trials with humans on this type of schedule for weeks on end, and pretty much every aspect of performance decreases. Testosterone tanks, cognitive performance, physical performance tanks. Yeah, but humans think they can outsmart their own biology.
Yeah. Well, to take that one step further, then, is it always the case that one uninterrupted block of sleep is superior? Or, are there cases where, yeah, maybe I'm going to go down for 4 hours or so, I'm up for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then I'm down for another 4 or 5 hours? Are those two comparable, or is it always generally in people's best interest to do one big block?
For most of the population who live in like have normal first world problems and live in a like comfortable environment, one consolidated bout is preferred. These more multiphasic sleep episodes is something you would see in more extreme environments. So we did a year-long longitudinal study of sleep down in Antarctica with there's an Argentinian naval base there. It's like the southernmost point in the world. So
Hmm.
6 months of the year, they have access to food, water, resources, medical care, and then the other 6 months of the world, they're like dead to the world. So we like naturally observe their sleep down there with like clinical grade sleep watches that you would get like if you went into a sleep clinic as part of a sleep study. And we actually found like they were still getting 8 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period, but because they were exposed to either like, right, 24 hours of light or 24 hours of darkness, based on like their own natural sleep schedules and their, operational schedule, they were able to get 8 hours. It just was divided up in
Hmm.
chunks. And then when we looked at their like blood pressure, their cognitive performance twice a day, it really didn't change much throughout the year. So there is an argument to be made that, ideally, yes, you want one consolidated bout of sleep if you are a normal, person with first world problems versus someone who's like deployed and or sleeping in an extreme environment like this.
Boz, I don't know what you've got. I don't know what you
Oh,
got left, but
I got so many questions.
okay. Ask,
But that's okay. We don't have to address them all
no,
yet.
no. Ask one or two more. Then I want to dive into
Okay.
the astronaut thing.
Okay. Sounds good. I'll give you one that I've always been curious about, and I have to frame it in the personal because I don't see it affecting too many other people. I hate napping. I've
I
always
hate
heard it's
napping
great.
too.
Okay, but every time I wake up from a nap, I feel worse than when I went down, so I just don't
Mhm.
do it. What's the deal?
So
You're
I don't
cursed.
nap because I mean, I'm like a highly functional, unmedicated person with ADHD, I feel, like that's my ADHD is like my superpower, I feel. Um, but there's a thing called a nappuccino. So hear me out. It was actually started in the trucking industry in the 70s, and we actually did a study at Walter Reed to like validate it for military use. If you pound coffee right before you take a nap, we use caffeine gum in our studies because it hits the brain within like 5 to 10 minutes. But if you pound like an espresso, take a nap, you will wake up feeling refreshed because it's going to take about 20 minutes for that caffeine in coffee to bind to the adenosine receptors. So then by the time you wake up from
Interesting.
a nap, you're going to feel great.
Interesting. Kind of power
That's
stacked
funny.
one on the other.
Yeah, I've always avoided. It's funny. My dad was a big napper whenever he had the opportunity. He was a big advocate for that sort of thing. But I can't do it. I hate it. It always makes me feel
Yeah.
worse. So
Yeah.
anyway,
I don't know
Well,
if I'm a
try
good
it. Let
napper or a
us,
bad
let me know how
napper.
you feel.
I always
yeah,
want to nap and then I fail. It just never happens.
yeah.
It just never works out. But I always have these grand plans and then life just eradicates them.
Yeah.
Uh, what, do you have one more, Boz?
No, I think, I mean, I could go all day on sleep related topics. I think it's
Yeah,
super
hit one if
interesting.
you
But
okay.
no, that's okay. Let's pivot and because yeah, there are other interesting topics, Pat. So yeah.
Well, I'm fascinated. You're I think the only person I've ever talked to that's had anything to do with the astronaut program. And you said that what was it here? You're going again. At present, you were a semifinalist in the class of 2020, and so
Mhm.
now you're throwing your hat back in the ring. what's the desire to get involved with the astronaut program?
So I've actually always wanted to be an astronaut. I grew up in Ohio, right? In Ohio, we're like home to the most presidents and the most astronauts. So it's like when I was growing up, I was like, oh, I want to be an Olympic athlete or an astronaut. I tried to make the 2008 Olympic team in track and field, never did, but whatever. Found my way into CrossFit. Did well in CrossFit, competed in a few games. But now it's like that's the second part of my career, right? It's like there's no blueprint to be an astronaut, but the military, we have certain selections. So I found out about the program 7 years ago. I applied, and actually, the first time I applied, I was at Power Monkey when NASA called, and that was back before we had Starlink. So NASA could not get a hold of me at Power Monkey for like 40 hours, except over by Dave's station, over in that back corner, there was like a tiny little signal. And so I actually found out the first time in 2021 that I had made it for selection at NASA. So I'd gone through a selection pool of 12,000 people, and I was in a group of 120 people who were
Oh,
invited
wow.
for selection.
That's a really serious cut. That's fantastic. And so,
Yep.
what would be it's funny because when I was a young man, I only wanted to do two things in the world. The one of them was be an astronaut. And then I looked into what was required to do that, and you had to be really smart. And I realized that I was out, and then I had to look other ways. But what would be your field? Would it be on the neurobiological side? Like, what do you know? You're not a pilot. Like, what is it you would be doing with the space program if you were able to get in there?
So every astronaut on mission has a role, and so they always have a science and engineer because, right, one of the big missions of NASA is like explore the unknown and like understand the impact of space travel on the human body. So I have my background's in neuroscience physiology. So that's essentially what I would do is I would direct all those like fascinating research projects that the
Awesome.
astronauts engage in. While somebody else, you're right, flies the spacecraft. And the engineers, but actually what happens is like one of the things I've learned being in the pipeline for about 6 years now is like it pays to have trade skills and to be like have those blue collar skills. Like
Mm.
I used to be a janitor for my high school during the summers to like make money. Like that's essentially what they're doing. They're cleaning up their own, poop. They're maintaining this space station that's been around since the 70s and operating on like essentially like old Windows Linux systems. Uh, they're just doing general maintenance of the space station because things are breaking all the time. And so, you have to be a good handy person, you have to be a good teammate, and like, sure, you have to be smart and a problem solver. But I think, the types of smarts and problem solving they're looking for is not someone who's say academically gifted. There's somebody who just, has the street smarts and just overall general intelligence.
Man. And is there anything, I guess, when do you find out how it's going for you? Is there anything you can do compared to the class of 2020 to make yourself in a better, more competitive position this time around? What's the deal there?
So what's interesting is they don't really provide you any feedback because they've been doing the same type of assessment and selection since the Gemini mission. Like I watched the right stuff before I went, and like half the things we had to do was like on the right stuff. So they haven't like changed what they're looking for, even though the mission sets have changed, which I guess makes sense, right? Because overall it's been a pretty successful program. Um, but they will tell you if you're like medically disqualified or psychologically
Mm.
unfit, which I've heard can be like as many as 50%. That's what a lot of that we get is you just do these really intensive medical screenings that you wouldn't even do if you did like a standard military physical. But I was fine. I didn't get to take the astronaut PT test, the last class, because that was during COVID. So for whatever reason, they like let us be around people and not have masks and stuff, but we weren't allowed in the gym to do the astronaut physical,
What's the
which does
astronaut
involve
PT test?
swimming.
Do you remember it?
I don't remember the specifics, but there's definitely a little bit of running, a little bit of swimming,
Okay.
They do a lot of deadlifts and squats in space. Like they have this
Mm.
machine where they're doing like thousands of reps of
Huh.
deadlifts and squats in a day to like maintain their muscle mass. Um, but yeah, so hopefully I make it back. Like basically I'm in waiting, right? I'm waiting to see if NASA has trickled down to the class of 120. And if they
Okay.
didn't, if I don't make it now, I'll just reapply again in 4 years. I think most astronauts spend 3 or 4 times in the pipeline applying before they actually make it. So
Is it something you could do on active duty, or do you have to leave active duty?
no, so actually I want to say like 80% of the astronauts are active duty. So
Oh, cool. Okay.
every single military branch has their own astronaut detachment at NASA. The Army's is incredibly small. It's, I think, 4 right now. So Frank Rubio, Ann McLean, Kate Rubins, and Drew Morgan. Those are the 4. The Army, the Navy, and the Air Force have like, you know, 95% of the Corps, because that's historically, it's always been like an Air Force Navy program. Um,
Fascinating.
so yeah, I can stay
Fascinating.
on active duty and be an astronaut and, hopefully bring CrossFit into space too. Although Johnny Kim kind of sort of did. So uh,
Oh, that'd be, yeah, if you could get a shot of you doing a thruster on the moon or something like that, that'd be a
that is true. They might
that'd
have
be
to
pretty
re-rig
awesome.
the machine, right? To not just
Yeah.
do deadlifts and squats.
Oh, that's very cool. I wish you absolutely nothing but the best with that. That would be
Yeah.
really awesome to circle back for an interview after you had maybe that under your belt. That'd be pretty great. But
Yep.
yeah, it's fascinating. You've got yourself one heck of a career, some very interesting specialties that apply to not only military members, but also athletes and also just regular people looking to get good sleep and have good cognitive function and all those things. So you're very much a wealth of knowledge and much appreciated.
Of course. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
absolutely. Happy to be a part of this community for a long time. So
Yeah, very cool. Well, and you're at West Point right now.
I am. Yeah, this is my 3rd day here. So
Okay, well, yeah, good luck. Good luck getting settled in. And at West Point, is it cadets? What do you call the students?
yeah, they're all cadets, the Corps of
Cadets,
Cadets.
Corps cadets. Okay, well, good luck. Good luck with the cadets. Get
Yeah.
them on the right track. So, if anybody has, thoughts or interest in these topics, find this show on the BTWB YouTube channel. Post your thoughts and experience as well. What's worked for you for sleep? What you found when you haven't got sleep. If you have future guests you want to hear about, interesting topics, post them there. We read all those. Find the Very Not Random Instagram account. You can post a public comment there. We see all those. Or if you want to be more private or anonymous, you can just send a direct message on the Very Not Random Instagram account. All those make their way to us as well. They help guide the future of the show. So for Dr. Allison Brager, Adrian Bosman, I'm Pat Sherwood, and we will see you next time.